So as a young boy in Alabama, I was in the Cub Scouts. And our Cub Scout group was given this great opportunity, along with a lot of other Cub Scout groups from across the state. We were given this great opportunity to explore and spend the night in DeSoto Caverns. Now, DeSoto Caverns is a pretty well-known cave in Alabama that was discovered by Hernando de Soto in the 16th century. I say discovered because Native Americans had been using that cave long before De Soto ever came along. But we were given this opportunity to come and be a part of this cave and explore it and sleep in it. And it was really cool because the caves were beautiful. They were full of the stalagmites and the stalactites, and I don't remember which one's which, but one of them goes from the ground up and the other one goes from the ceiling down. They had this pool of water that had these fish in there, and because the caves are so dark, the fish have no need for eyes, and so they didn't have eyes. There were these fish just swimming around, and they did not have eyes. It was just really cool for a small boy in the Cub Scouts to be able to be a part of this experience. So we were all getting ready that night to call it a night, to crawl in our sleeping bags and get ready to go to sleep. The guides had told us that when they turned out the lights that it was going to be pitch black. But there was no real way for us to truly know how dark it was going to be until they turned those lights off. And when they turned those lights off, it was the epitome of pitch black. And so we are sleeping in this nothingness inside this cave. And I remember sometime in the middle of the night, me and a few other boys, we woke up to the sounds of another boy talking. And it was apparent to us that this other boy was talking in his sleep. But it was also apparent to us that he was not just talking in his sleep, but he was also walking in his sleep, because his voice was kind of carrying, moving around in the cave. But that didn't last long, because eventually we heard this loud thud, which was followed by another thud, and we heard the boy start moaning and groaning until eventually he got quiet again. Well, the guides rushed around to try to get some lights on inside the cave so that we could see what was going on. They got the lights on, and we found this boy from another Cub Scout troop lying on the floor of the cave, asleep in front of one of those stalagmites. He'd been sleepwalking, and he just rammed right into one of those things and just fell down and went back to sleep right there where he was. Walking in the Dark. Walking in the Dark is the title of this new series that we're going to be spending some time in this month. And I believe it's the perfect metaphor for the current realities of our world, the current realities of our lives. See, walking in the dark is this metaphor for being in uncharted territory. Walking in the dark is this metaphor for being in places that are unknown to us, and we're not real sure what's going to happen next, and we're not real sure what's around the corner, and we don't really know what to do, and so we are walking in the dark. And I know that all of you have walked in the dark before, and when you're walking in the dark, you're feeling around with your hands, trying to find something to guide you. And you're feeling around with your hands just trying to find something familiar. And you don't walk with your normal stride. Instead, you kind of slide your feet across the floor because you don't know if there's a step in front of you. You don't know if there's an obstacle in front of you. You don't know if you're just going to step off into a hole. And walking in the dark often fills us with fear and anxiety, just because of that unknown that's out there. I feel like the world right now is walking in the dark. COVID-19 has turned out the lights on the world. COVID-19 has created a scenario where everyone seems to be walking in the dark. No one really knows what's going to happen next. No one's really sure what we're supposed to do, or what's going to solve the problem, or what's going to flatten the curve, or what's going to prevent us from getting sick from someone else. No one's real sure about any of that. And we've got politicians and healthcare experts and scientists that are all walking in the dark. They're doing their best. I believe that. They are doing their best to try to help us through this, but in the end, they're walking in the dark. They're in uncharted territory, and they're feeling around with their hands, trying to find something familiar, trying to find something to guide them, and really, that's what we're all doing right now. We're all walking in the dark. We're all in uncharted territory. We're all in this unknown place. And for many of us, fear and anxiety has become the norm. But see, this isn't just about COVID-19, and this just isn't just about this current pandemic that we are in. Because long before coronavirus came along, many of you felt like you were walking in the dark. Many of you experienced situations in your life where you felt like you were in uncharted territory and you weren't real sure what was coming next, and you were filled with fear and anxiety. I know I've had those moments. And long after COVID-19 is gone, we will all experience those moments at different times in our lives and different situations where we will discover that we are in uncharted territory, that we are in unknown places, that we are walking in the dark, and we're not real sure what's going to happen, what we need to do, where we need to go. And so this series is about that. It's about those moments in our lives that fill us with fear and anxiety. And for a lot of us, that's walking in the dark. And so before we kind of jump into things this morning, I really want us to spend a little time discussing this. Talk about a time or a situation in your life when you felt like you were walking in the dark. Maybe for you, that's right now, but I know a lot of you have stories from your past where you felt like you were truly walking in the dark, that you were in unknown territory and you didn't know what was going to happen or how you were going to get through. Why don't you spend a little time talking about those moments and then come back and we will dive into the series. So, preparing for this series, Zach Sewell shared a passage of scripture with me that I really loved, and I just thought it fits so well with the series. And we're not necessarily going to study this passage, we're just going to let it sit there. We're just going to let it sit over the entire series. It's Isaiah 42 and verse 16. There, God says, I will lead the blind by a road they do not know. By paths they have not known, I will guide them. I will turn the darkness before them into light, the rough places into level ground. These are the things I will do, and I will not forsake them. I love that passage. I think it's so beautiful and fits so well with this idea of walking in the dark. And God says, I'm going to lead them by paths they do not know. I'm going to take those rough places and I'm going to smooth them out for them. And so we're just going to let that passage just kind of sit over this entire series. You know, God's people are not unfamiliar with walking in the dark. As a matter of fact, it seems that the opposite is true. There's story after story after story in the Bible where it shows that God's people are actually intimately familiar with walking in the dark. You've got this man Abram, who in Genesis chapter 12 is called by God to go from your country, to go from your people, from your father's household to a land that I will show you. He's called to go to a place he's never been to before. You've got Israel, who spends 400 years as slaves in Egypt. And then when they are rescued from their slavery, they end up wandering the wilderness for 40 years. You've got Naomi and her family in the book of Ruth who experienced this famine that is so bad that it forces them to leave their home and to go into unknown country. You've got Esther and all the Jews in Persia who are facing a possible genocide. And I'm just scratching the surface, right? Story after story, on and on I could go. All these stories that talk about God's people walking in the darkness, God's people entering uncharted territory, God's people finding themselves by paths they have not known. And so that's what the series is about. And it's in these moments where we find ourselves walking in the dark that we find some of our biggest fears and anxieties come to the surface. And so my goal for this series is to answer this question. What do we need to hold on to, or what do we need to remember to help us navigate the darkness? What are some of those things that we need to remember, that we need to hold close to our heart, that we need to hold close to our mind? Some of those things that we need to remember and hold on to that will help us to manage our fears, to manage our anxieties, to navigate the darkness. And so this sermon series, each sermon in the series is going to kind of answer that question. What's something we need to remember as we walk in the dark? And so in Genesis 15, we find this man named Abram who complains to God about his childlessness. Now, Abram is better known as Abraham, but this is actually before his name is changed. And so he finds himself childless, and he blames God for this, right? He says, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Now, Abram comes across sounding a little whiny if you really read the story closely. But God seems to be rather patient with Abram in this moment. And God comes back to him and says, "This man, this servant that you speak of, he will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." And so God promises Abram a child. That's Genesis 15. Well, you get into Genesis 16, and I don't know how much time has elapsed between Genesis 15 and Genesis 16, but when we get into Genesis 16, we're told that Abram's wife Sarai has still not had children. She's still not gotten pregnant. So what do you do? Right? What do you do when God has promised you something and it has not happened yet? What do you do? Well, if you're Abram and Sarai, what you do is you get a little creative and you try to find some ways that you can help God along, right? You think God needs some help. And so here's what we're told. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." You get creative and you try to help God along. And so this is Sarai, and you got to love the next line. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. I like the old King James Version. It says, "And Abram hearkened to Sarai's voice." Now, even if you've never heard this story before in your life, you have to know that this is not a good idea. You have to know that this isn't going to work. There's no way this is going to work, right? But sometimes when we get impatient with God, we resort to making stupid decisions. Maybe stupid is too strong of a word. But when we do get impatient with God, sometimes we resort to trying to hurry things up. And we get creative and we come up with ways to help God out, as if God needs a little nudge. And so I think this is another great discussion time. Why don't we spend a little time talking about a time in your life when you got impatient with God's timing. You don't necessarily have to talk about the ways you tried to speed up God's plan, but maybe just talk about a time in your life when your timing and God's timing didn't coincide and you got impatient with God's timing. Spend a little time talking about that and then come back and we will continue with this. So your gut was right. It doesn't work. Now, Hagar does get pregnant, so I guess technically it does work, but it doesn't work the way that Abram and Sarai expect it to work. As soon as Hagar gets pregnant, there's immediate tension in the home, and we could have all seen that one coming, right? As soon as Hagar gets pregnant, Sarai and Hagar immediately start resenting one another. And Sarai blames Abram for the way that she feels. She blames Abram for what she's going through, and she calls it the wrong that I am suffering. I gotta say that Sarai does not come out looking so sweet and innocent in the story. But Abram doesn't come out looking much better either, because Abram ends up saying to her, your slave is in your hands, right? Do with her whatever you think is best. Right? She's your problem. You take care of it. And then we read, Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So now we have this pregnant Egyptian slave wandering the desert all alone. She's trying to escape from a childless, crazy couple that eventually becomes our mother and father of faith. What a story, right? What a crazy story. And I would say that Hagar, in many ways, finds herself walking in the dark. Hagar is in uncharted territory. The trouble that she finds herself in is not trouble that is of her own doing. She didn't ask for this. And I imagine as she wandered that desert pregnant, I imagine she was full of fear and anxiety. And so the question becomes, where's God in all of this? Where's God in all of this? So let's read the rest of the story. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. So where was God in all of this? God was right there listening. God was right there listening to the whole thing. He was listening the whole time. Of this son that Hagar is going to give birth to, he says, you're going to name him Ishmael. And Ishmael means God hears. And God does hear. God hears. He heard the cries of her misery. He was listening. And I think one of the really cool things that I love about this story is that Hagar is an Egyptian. She's not an insider, but rather she's an outsider. She's someone who was unfamiliar with this God, Yahweh, yet God still heard her. God still listened intently to her cries. And so Hagar ends up giving this unfamiliar God a name. And she names him the God who sees me. You know, for some people in this world, that's all they really desire. To be seen. That's all they want, is to be seen. There's an author who once said, understand this if you understand nothing. It is a powerful thing to be seen. And Hagar discovered the power of being seen. She discovered the God that doesn't miss a thing. He sees. He not only sees, but he hears. And he listens intently to the cries of the distressed. And so, about 5 chapters later in Genesis 21, we're going to read another story about Hagar. This time, Abram is now Abraham, and Sarai is now Sarah. And by this point, Sarah has gotten pregnant and given birth to her baby boy named Isaac. And once again, Sarah does not come out looking so good, because she thinks that Hagar's son Ishmael is mocking her son Isaac. And so she goes to Abraham and she says, get rid of that slave woman. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. And again, Abraham does what his wife tells him to do. He listens to her. He does what the King James says. He hearkened to her voice. And so we read that he ends up giving them some food and some water, and he sends them out into the desert. Well, Hagar and Ishmael are out in the desert. They're walking in the darkness again. And while they're out there, their food and their water runs out. And Hagar knows that they're not going to live much longer. And she can't stand to watch her son die. And so she puts her son under a bush in a shade, and she walks away. And as she walks away, she eventually falls to her knees, crying, I cannot watch this boy die. And she's crying, she's sobbing. And then we read these words. God heard the boy crying. God heard the boy crying. Church, I want you to know that God hears. God hears. He hears you cry. He hears your sorrows. He hears your laments. He hears your laughter and your joy and your singing and your praising. God hears it all. He listens. And when we're walking in the darkness and we're feeling around with our hands trying to find something familiar, and we're scooting our feet across the floor in hopes that we don't trip over something, and we're full of fear and we're full of anxiety over what might happen next, I want you to know that God hears. That God hears. When the Israelites were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, God goes to Moses and says, I have indeed seen, he has seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out, and I'm concerned about their suffering. Over and over in the Psalms, we read this line, the Lord heard my cries for mercy. God hears. And I want you to know that. I want you to hold that close to your heart. I want you to hold that close to your mind. His timing may not be in sync with our timing, and he may not respond in the ways that we hope he will respond, and his answers may not look like the answers we envision. But I want us to rest assured that we worship and we serve a God who hears his people. He listens intently. So if you want to cry out, cry out. Cry out in pain, cry out in sorrow, cry out in fear and anxiety. God hears. God is listening. So may you, when you find yourselves walking in the darkness, may you hold close to your heart this truth. God